Hey, Chris, how you doing?
Good, how are you?
Yeah, great. Fired up to be here with everybody.
These are soft chairs.
They are soft chairs. They're nice. I think our chief product officer is looking at some for her dining room. So.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Thanks for making the trip.
Sure.
Maybe we can just start off, just kind of introduce yourself, tell people what you do and what your team's responsible. We'll just kind of start there.
Sure, yeah. My name is Chris Kohr. I'm Vice President of Engineering at Salesforce for developer productivity. On our internal, say, monolithic application, we have this large application, and we have many developers that contribute code to this code base, a very large code base.
Right.
And so I'm responsible for a handful of teams that are focused on the tooling and the workflows to ensure that developers can make changes to that system safely.
Nice. So it sounds like a lot of responsibility to the rest of the engineering teams, right?
It is, yeah. I do think of our internal developers as my customers or stakeholders.
Sure.
So it helps to ensure that we're doing the right things for our people. Nice.
So what are some of the key priorities for your team? Like, what are the things that you're working on to help all the other engineers right now?
It's really about unblocking them on things that they need to do, giving them a faster feedback loop on anything that, like testing and on builds and on different changes that they need to do. So whatever we can do to actually improve that feedback time, that's the key, and that's what we're focused on.
Is that something that you measure as a team or organization? Do you think about that feedback time, or I'm sure you get plenty of feedback about the...
We do, and it's interesting. It's a matter of, it helps us prioritize a little bit, right? So you think about the different, first off, how many people actually do a specific, we think of things like jobs to be done or customer user journeys, and these are like very specific tasks. And like how many actual developers do a specific job, right? So you have what we call a TAM, right? Total addressable market for a specific thing. So you bring in like these business terms. It's really interesting. And then you have a frequency, is like how often do they do it? Do they do it once a week, once a month, once a whatever? And then how long does that take, right? And so you multiply all of those different values, and then you can kind of like stack rank, like, okay, these are the different projects. And if we can save, a handful of minutes on something that they're doing like really quickly on their, like they do frequently, like we should very much focus on those projects.
Right. And I think earlier you're saying you've been with this team for about 4 years, right?
Yeah, I've been at Salesforce for about 8 years, I think, 8 years, yeah. And but focused on developer productivity in the last 4, yeah.
Nice. So one of the things that I mean, we're talking a lot about here is kind of the flow state, getting into the flow, clearly, getting the feedback quickly and being able to respond to what the developers need also, ties into developer happiness and all those things. How do you all think about flow state
yeah, so flow state is interesting. When I was doing development myself, I remember being very trying to solve some kind of gnarly problem, right? And just working on the keyboard, trying something, debugging it, recompile, rerun the unit test, restart the app, see if it actually works, and being in that state for hours on end.
Yeah.
And so I always try to think how do I ensure that developers can it's actually a very I like being in that state. I don't code very much anymore, but sometimes you get in that state when you're writing the right documents or working on some things.
I remember getting in trouble with that state, saying I was going to be home in an hour,
yes.
And then 3. That never happened to you, right?
No, well, it has, but working from home, it's not so bad anymore.
Right. So how do you, when you think about creating an experience for your customers, the other engineers, how do you think about what you can do to help them stay in that flow state?
Yeah, so we have this kind of terms, what is it called? It's keyboard time and coffee time. So I don't know if you've ever heard about this, but keyboard time is when you're typing at the keyboard and you're actually able to focus. And then coffee time is where something might eject you from that flow state, and where it's oh, you know what, I need to go re-index the database or something like that. And it actually takes, it's going to take 10 minutes or 15 minutes or even a day. And you're all right, I need to go do something else. Getting more of our tooling so that, and getting more of our flow so that it actually changes it so that those steps move from a coffee time to a keyboard time. That is our biggest focus. Like, okay, how do we get more people to get that feedback loop faster and faster so that they can stay in that, like, so it's a voluntary thing to leave the flow state versus an involuntary thing.
Right, right. One of the things I'm curious, has the shift to more remote work and hybrid had an impact on how people are using your tools and, you know, kind of that flow state?
It had, well, let's see now, I'm trying to think. I want to say it depends. It kind of depends on a lot of developers and how they mentally like focus on things. It's worked really well for some developers and hasn't worked well for other developers. We found that people that are more experienced in areas and people more experienced in the technologies that they're working on, like being remote and being sort of removed from the office life, it's been really good. Onboarding new developers has been, it's a little challenging for them, right? And so trying to get them up to speed, trying to get them onboarded has, it's a lot easier when you're in the office and you can walk down the aisle and say, hey, can you help me out with something? But now it's very much a, hey, can I set up a Google Meet or Slack them or whatever. So yeah.
How do like the tools that you're developing, I assume, have an impact on onboarding, right? Mm-hmm. And as people are coming up, are you and your team focused on trying to streamline things, make it easier for them?
Yes, very much so. And that's one of our major personas, right? The folks that have been at Salesforce for like 0 to 1 years, right? So trying to get them to a point where they are comfortable making a change into our production systems, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have this monolithic code base, and like anybody that's worked on a monolithic code base, you're like, oh, am I gonna pull the wrong Jenga block out of this tower and everything? Right. And so providing tooling and providing ways that developers can get a faster feedback on the impact that they have in a safe way, right? So we want to allow them to do automated testing and all this other fun stuff in a controlled environment so that when they make the change, they can do it and allow and make sure that they're not like committing like this horrible atrocity to our main code line. On top of that, we work with onboarding folks. So we have onboarding classes for our engineers. And so we have this like code in week 1 kind of class where a developer like spins up our core application. They go through the process of making a change and they see what test failures fail and that's like, they get that done in 1 week. So they actually there's a little bit of hand-holding associated to that, right. And it's very prescriptive in the way we do it. So it's like, okay, you need to do these things just so that they, it's like asking the first question in Stack Overflow. It's like, well, what am I going to do? And am I going to get like, so it provides a safe space for them to make these changes to our systems. Nice.
So you talk about starting out. I mean, one of the things, whenever you start a new job, right, there's this massive learning curve. Mm-hmm. And, we've also talked about one of the things that is really important to engineers and organizations is a culture of learning. How do you or your leaders or Salesforce think about balancing learning and keyboard time, shall we say?
Yeah. Well, I was thinking about this because learning is sort of an input thing, and then coding is sort of an output thing, right? So it's like, are you learning or are you coding or are you doing both? And so learning, there's a couple of different aspects of learning, right? So it's like learning in the micro state, which is you have an issue with your code. And so how do I get an answer to this very...
Stack Overflow?
Sure,
oh,
sure.
Yeah.
little plug there, yeah. So Stack Overflow has actually been pretty good with that. And so people can do a lot of stuff in self-service, right? And so that's the key is that if somebody can answer their question in a self-service capacity, that's awesome, right? Because then it's like, okay, I can do this, I search, I find an answer, keep on moving.
Right.
And that actually keeps you in that flow state, right? So it doesn't mean like, oh, I'm waiting for somebody else to answer, I don't have to G-chat them or Slack them or something like that. And so they can keep on going.
Nice. So, I know you mentioned a lot of data as you were talking about how you prioritize things. And my understanding is Salesforce is very data-driven. Do you all look at measurements around productivity or flow efficiency or things of that nature?
Yeah, so this goes into the keyboard time and coffee time, right? So we found that it's around, you can stay in this flow state, and that for, it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to kind of get into that flow state.
Right.
So that's the first part. And then it takes about 40 seconds, maybe 20 to 40 seconds. I heard there's a study somewhere on this one.
Yeah.
They kind of eject you from it. And so we look at a lot of things to try to bring things back in, or and to make sure that the testing and the tooling and everything else is very deterministic in the way that it actually gives you feedback, right? So the worst thing is that we provide you feedback and say, hey, this is wrong, and it's like, well, no, it's actually right. So we're trying to build very deterministic ways of understanding your code change, whether or not it is safe to actually put into production. So, yeah.
And how has that been received by your engineers? Have you had pretty good success with that?
It's been mixed, right?
Yeah.
So, and it's challenging, right? Because you have a company that's, we're a fairly large company. We've been around for a while, right? And so we have a large code base that has a lot of history associated to it, right? And so you have and you have a lot of different personas. And so it's a matter of trying to, when you're a small company, you can kind of put the whole code base in your head. So I don't know if you've ever been worked on a code base where it's like, oh yeah, I know everything, and so the individual pieces. As you
all the people,
right? And actually, that's another thing, right? Is that the projects that people work on, it very much depends on how many interaction points you have with other teams, right? And so as you focus on projects or whatnot, if you have to interact with all these other teams to succeed, that project is going to take longer and longer just because of the sort of the asynchronous aspects of it. And so providing ways that developers can actually go to these teams and say, okay, I did my due diligence to ensure that this change is safe, that interaction point, that time that they have to interact with other teams to approve their changes and whatnot becomes very short.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned that, and it reminds me of, I don't know if you remember the visual that Prashant showed. I should remember the company, but it showed kind of the interactions across all the different organizations. I can imagine with a monolith the size that I imagine it being, that there are a lot of different teams across the org, and that you have all those cross-channel or cross-team conversations.
Oh yeah, there are. And it's sort of like it's interesting, right? Because it works. I mean, we clearly deploy 3 times a year these major changes. We just had a big conference about all the great things we're putting on there. But there's a lot of interaction points. There's a lot of different places where touch points between different areas of the code, and so it becomes very much a collaborative environment to make significant changes into our system.
Yeah. Well, how do you help the engineers navigate that, or it just seems really tricky.
Yeah, we have it is kind of interesting because how should we put this? The best engineers, or the most successful engineers, they have some kind of mentoring system, right? So we have, we provide these areas where we have engineers, they get mentors either within their team or within their group or within other groups to help guide them, right? So to ensure that they have somebody to talk to in sort of a safe way, and to help them kind of move around our code base. And so the mentoring system has actually worked out really well, and we've found a lot of people like it as well. I mean, it's a one-to-one kind of interaction. So it's not like it's a group thing. It's like, being able to have some kind of trail guide to help you along the way.
Right. Trail guide, that sounds familiar.
Oh, yeah, I know.
So when you think about the leaders in your organization, what kind of advice do you give them to help them with their engineers?
Yeah. So not like, should step back a little bit.
Okay.
It's a lot of it's about trust, right? So do you as a people leader trust your engineers to do work when you're not looking at them, right? It's funny, we have this thing called No Interruption Thursday.
Okay.
Which is no meetings. Thursday is no meetings, that's it. We try our best,
right.
To be fair. We try our best to not have meetings on that day. And it's very well received by our engineers, and it's very well received by our managers as well, because they're able to like actually focus on some of these things that they've like stacked up beforehand. But actually dedicating like a day towards some of these things is really great. We're actually experimenting with an asynchronous week, which is like no meetings for the entire week and see what happens. And it's like throughout the company too. So so far it's been well received.
Right.
People feel more productive. And that's the thing. I think it's feeling more productive, right? So do you feel like, are you productive versus do you feel more productive? And I think the feeling of productivity is super important for developers and for engineering leaders and for teams as well, right? If you have morale issues on your team, like, do they not feel productive? Do they not understand the impact of their change? Do they have to interact with are they blocked by a lot of things?
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that developers and everybody else do feel productive. One of the other things on this one is we started doing team agreements. And so you as a team, like as a Scrum team, you create an agreement on how you want to work. It might sound a little like woo-woo, but it's actually pretty good, right? Where you actually establish baseline rules, and so it manages expectations, right? That's the whole thing, right? It's managing expectations. Things have an SLA, things have something else. Like, should mornings? Should we not have meetings on mornings? Should we have some expectations around what should be in our sprint or stand-up? Do meetings need to have agendas attached to it? Yes, no. Do I have the right to decline your meeting if it doesn't have an agenda? Little things like this. And I think there's a little bit more information online around team agreements and how to do them properly. I probably can't do it justice here, but
I've actually used that same approach, and I think it's great because you're right. They're a little nuanced between teams, right? Mm-hmm. And especially where people are distributed, they're remote. Well, do you start at 9 a.m.? Is that Pacific time? Is that Eastern time? All those things that you kind of take for granted when you're in the office, being explicit about them improves the trust, within the organization, within the team, allows you to be more effective, et cetera. I love that. That's great.
And you mentioned remote as well. That's always been a tricky topic because mornings are very much impacted at my company because we have a group of engineers over in Hyderabad, right, in Bangalore, and so it is 9 a.m. here is 9:30 p.m. there based on daylight saving. Oh no, sorry, I'm Pacific time. In New York, it's a little bit better, but only off by a little bit. Yeah, but in California, it's a 12-hour difference. So it is either significantly impacting them or you, like either doing late night meetings. But that's part of the agreements, right? So it's like, okay, we need to make sure that we have these meetings. We need to make sure that we don't have morning meetings on Fridays because, that's Friday night for them. So it's all this kind of thing. If you have folks in Israel too, you got to, their weekends are Sundays and Mondays. So it's these different things, right? You have to be culturally aware of your engineering groups because the more you are tuned into them, the more I think the more they appreciate it and the better interactions you have with them.
Right. The more trust, the more engaged.
Right.
The more comfortable people are to take chances and do their best work. Right.
Right. Yes.
I love that. At Stack, we're very distributed as well, and all the things you say ring absolutely true. So, I think speaking of international, we'll probably take some questions from the Slido as those start coming up. But I'm curious too, just in terms of your own productivity, your flow. How do you think about for yourself, right? I mean, you think about getting in and out of the flow state or participating. How does that look for you?
Well, at this point, my flow state is about documentation. So, you know, as leaders, you're required to set direction, right? That is probably the best, most important thing to do, is be able to set direction, get alignment on your teams to make sure that that's the right thing.
Right.
I love to use stories associated to that, right? So, you know, what does a day in the life of a developer do? Like, what are all their impacts? And so as you can kind of like write some of these stories, and they can be science fiction, it's fine, whatever.
Yeah.
But if you can help sort of like put a narrative on how developers work, their blocks, their issues, whatnot, it helps align folks to just a cohesive vision on what you're actually trying to do, right? And so it's always funny because you have all these different teams that are sort of working in their own silos, and unless they have an idea of like how their piece of the puzzle fits into the larger puzzle,
right.
It's hard for them to understand how their changes are actually impacting all the other customers and all the other developers out there.
And so the way you're addressing that is through these stories. Like, I'm curious, how do you, because silos is something, you know, we've talked a lot about already here today, and an organization the size of Salesforce, I'm sure it's, you know, it's even more challenging than others. Like, how do you?
Well, and this goes back into one of the first ones, which is around like customer user journeys or jobs to be done, right? So a job, you know, I need to create a data model in our database or whatnot. And so all these different things allow a person to, you know, create a custom table or a standard table inside of our application system. And so there's the building of the tooling, the building of the definition, there's the testing of it, there's the building of it, the compiling of it, and everything else. And so different teams might actually be focused on different parts of that. And unless you actually tie in those teams together to understand, okay, this is what the developer actually was doing at the beginning, the tools and the things that they had, and this is what they have at the end. If you can tie that all together, you know, the person at the end is like, oh, well, we should be able to do this testing back here. Like, why don't we just do this here so that they're not waiting a day for their changes when we can actually just do a really, like a 1-minute test at the beginning. And so giving them, helping put all that perspective together it's awesome. It's great. I love it.
That's super exciting.
Yeah.
Very cool. Let me, we'll take some questions online here. Let's see. How about, how do you, I'll read this real quick. How do your metrics, how do you get metrics needed to inform your team about productivity, blockers, et cetera? And have you been able to make the devs feel that you're not treating them like a code factory?
Yeah. We do a lot of, we actually do customer advisory boards for our internal developers. And so every team is I don't want to say it's unique, but it's different, right? Mm-hmm. And so every team kind of does things a little bit differently. And so this is the hard work, right? Is that if you don't have like product owners and folks that actually help talk to customers, it's, you need to make that connection, right? The other one is we do have a lot of forums internally where we get a lot of advice on what's bad, right? And we take it all seriously, right? So we have forums where people complain about tooling, everything else, and it's not like it's not like yelling into the ocean. It's like we actually do take this, we put it as part of our priority set, and we actually bring in those people that complain and say, okay, help us understand what the problems are and how to make it better. Mm-hmm. I don't know if I answered the question, but
So I think the other part of the question was metrics for teams around productivity, mm-hmm. Flow, et cetera. I mean, one of my observations that I share often is that as engineers, we like to measure things, but we don't like to be measured, right?
Yeah. What was the quote? There's a quote that somebody said it where it's, tell me how you measure me, I'll tell you how I perform.
Right.
Something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. Especially engineers, right?
Right, and they're going to game the system in all kinds of different ways, right? And it's in my nature, it's in everybody's nature. It's like, oh yeah, sure. And so it's very, so you do have to be cautious about this, right? And so measuring at an individual level, you want to avoid that, because anytime you do that, you're going to weaponize that number, and it's going to be like, oh, well, I do X number of user stories, and I'm better than everybody else. It's like, well, no, it's really the team, right? So as a team, you are doing something. And I do this because like I pull in like product managers and engineering managers should be like, it impacts them as well. Like if you have one rock star and like or I hate the term rock star, but like one person that's, very prolific in the amount of code that they do, but they're not helping the rest of their team, it's not a healthy team. Right? And so you should, like, it's focusing on healthy teams. And so we have, velocity is always a weird thing, right? Because it's like, oh, can you get your velocity up? And my focus on that one is like, you don't really want velocity up or down. You want it consistent, right? So the better you can have a consistent set of velocity is user stories and all that other fun stuff. If you can make that consistent, that's really what you're focused on, is like,
predictable.
So it's predictability, right? And so that it's about trust, like, okay, we can get this done by this date because we have a history of being very predictable and reliable.
Yeah, it's not the absolute number, it's the trend and being able to observe it. The other thing I like is being able to use it for experimentation, right? Like if a team wants to try, maybe they make their stories bigger or smaller, how does that impact things? And if they're not measuring, then it's hard to evaluate your experiments.
Yeah, and some teams, there's no one size fits all. We like to think there is, but everybody sort of measures a little bit differently, which is fine, right? And so, but work with your leaders to manage those expectations, right? And so I think that's the biggest thing, is that if you meet these expectations of your leaders and you and your team, you're in a good spot.
Great, thank you. Let's see. Do you have any advice? This is a good one, especially given your role, getting buy-in across the entire organization, engineering organization, when you're introducing new practices or tooling?
We do internal pilots, internal betas, internal like everything else on all of our products, right? And so that's really how we do it. We try to come up with a metric like, hey, we think this is going to improve cycle time or some aspect of developer productivity. And so we take that, we put it as a project and say, okay, this is what we think we're going to be succeeding in. We do the experiment, and then we use that to help influence leadership and everybody else that this is an important thing that we should actually be doing. And I think the experimentation, and that's the thing, is that you need to be very cool with experimenting and having some experiments fail. It happens, right? And so if you have a culture of experimentation and a culture of allowing flexibility in these areas, you're gonna be good.
Do you start with an anticipated outcome and measure against that, or how do you?
It's funny. We start with anticipated outcome. We do that, and then we do reflect on it afterwards and say, okay, well, maybe we had some unintended consequences or unintended benefits that we didn't understand to begin with, right? So it's like, hey, maybe we didn't get faster, but all of our changes we no longer have bugs in production because of this change or something like that, or whatnot. And so, like, it's a twofold measurement. Like, you have to go into it with some theory, right? Otherwise, like, why do it?
Exactly. What's the point then? Right? Great. Well, unfortunately, I think we're at time. I've really enjoyed talking with you. I hope everybody else has. You've been great. Thank you so much for your time.
It was great. Thank you.